What's going on, everybody? Nick here, and in this video I'm going to run you through a laundry list of make.com hacks that'll both help you build your scenarios like 3 times faster at least, and save a ton of money in operations. These are hacks that I painstakingly had to learn the hard way over the course of the last 3 to 4 years of building on make.com, and I'm going to help you learn them in about half an hour instead. So if that sounds like something you guys want to improve on and learn, then this is the video for you. Stay tuned and let's get into it. All right, we're going to start quick and simple with a few keyboard shortcuts. If you were to try and drag a module around in a scenario like I'm doing right now, that's great. But what if you wanted to drag a bunch together? Well, that's where shift click comes in handy. Just hold shift, click, and then drag, and you can now select a bunch of modules at the same time. Super quick and easy. I had somebody ask me this in the community the other day, so I thought I would bring it up. The next is Control S or Command S if you are on Mac. Every time you hold Command and press S or hold Control and press S, you'll see that little purple save dialog happen in the bottom right-hand corner. Basically what I do is every time I make a major change to my scenario, whether that's add a new module, change the configuration of some, I just hold Command, press S really quickly, and then I save. And the reason why you want to do that is because if you go to More and then go Previous Versions over here, you'll see that you've actually, like Make has actually stored a list of all of the major changes that you've made to your scenario. And if you save the most recent one, you'll end up with a list of all the most recent changes that you've made. It just makes it really easy for you to roll back things without necessarily having to go ask yourself, crap, I really like the way my scenario was working a week ago. What the hell do I need to do to make it go like that, right? I've wasted dozens of hours trying to rebuild things from scratch when I could have just used this. So hopefully that saves you guys a fair amount of time. The next, and probably one of the highest impact little hacks that I had to learn, again, the hard way, was if you just right-click a scenario or a module and then click Run this module only, it'll actually only run that specific module. So as opposed to me trying to run all 25 modules in my flow here and waste 25 operations every time I test, I can just test the specific thing that I'm curious about by right-clicking and then pressing Run this module only. I do this a lot in all of my videos, as you guys see. If you guys are avid watchers of my content, you'll know how to do this on your end. But essentially, this eliminates the long feedback loop. Like if you think about it, when you're testing a make.com flow using iterative testing, like I recommend you guys do, every time that you have to run every single module in a flow, you're basically wasting like 30 seconds, a minute. Sometimes scenarios take like 5 or 10 minutes to run even. And if you think about the ability to learn from what is wrong and then make the change and then use that to make your scenario better, that's a really, really long feedback loop. Imagine if you could just right click, press a button, and then within 2 seconds know exactly what's wrong. You're obviously going to be able to build much faster, right? And that's at the core of what I personally do and why I'm able to move things so quickly, essentially push the needle forward in my own business. All right, the next thing I want to talk about are set and get variable modules. If you haven't worked with these before, they can be sort of intimidating. So what I'm going to do here is build a purposeful flow just to cover this concept. What I have here is I have 4 modules. If you count the router, if you don't, it's 3. And on the leftmost side, we have a basic trigger module. This just allows, it's basically like another set variable module. It just allows you to start flow using this as just like a default trigger. So we don't need an action module here. We're just using the basic trigger. Next up, we have a set variables module. And if I give this a click, you'll see that what I've done is I've set a variable whose name is equal to Peter Lockheed. If I give this a click, you'll see how I did it. I just wrote name and then I wrote Peter Lockheed. Pretty straightforward, right? Next, I have a router. I just zoom in a little too much there. So let me delete this. But next I have a router. And that router, if you only have one route in a flow or a scenario, it's just going to continue along the route. It's going to pretend like nothing was here. It only really ever does something if you have multiple variables or multiple modules in a flow, which I'll show you how that works in a moment. But then that last thing that runs is just this get variable module. And the way that it works is you pump in the name of the variable, okay, the variable key, and then it grabs the value for you. So if you think about it, the output of this is basically equivalent to the output of this. And most people's question is, well, like, Nick, why would you want to do this? The reason why is because this gives you an extra layer of flexibility when you're designing scenarios, particular scenarios that have routes. Take a look at this variable up here, or this module. This is set multiple variables, but I'm now setting a name and I'm changing the value of this variable. Instead of Peter Lockheed, it's now Jackson Lockheed, right? And if I give this a quick little run, you'll see that every module in my scenario ran. But if I click on this down here, which is what I'm curious about, the value of the variable is Peter Lockheed. But pay close attention to the way that these routers work. This says first, this says second. Basically, this is the the order in which the various routes are executed. If I were to unlink this, then link this back, you'll see that now this is first, this is second. If I were to run this, what do you think would happen? Well, now because this ran before this, we've essentially changed the variable value. It's now Jackson Lockheed instead of Peter Lockheed. So these are two hacks. The first is how to use set and get. And the second is the fact that routers will proceed in the order in which they're connected. If I unlink both of these again and then start with this, that'll be first, that'll be second. A lot of the time people use routers as sort of like logical ways to change the way that a flow works depending on whether or not something is found. They use filters basically. So give us a click, they'll say if x equals to 2, and then down here it'll be like if x is equal to 1, right? And so if x is equal to 1, it can't be equal to 2, therefore you'll only ever execute a single route. But if you don't constrain the way that a router, like if you don't add filters after a router, it'll just run all of these routes for you. And that's where you can start doing some really cool logic. So if you go back here to this other scenario, the one that I started with, you'll see that I actually make use of that exact same design pattern here. I will set a variable called section text, the contents of which aren't very relevant. And then I will route here with a 25% probability to the secondary function. And 25% of the time I'll run it, and then I'll set a new variable up here. The other 70% of the time, 75% of the time, I don't actually do this at all. But you'll notice that regardless, I'm getting the variable. So in terms of the flow, it's basically, if I could explain it visually, it would be 75% of the time we set a variable called section text, and then we just get that same variable. So nothing changes. This is basically equivalent to this. But 25% of the time we'll go up this route, we'll set section text again, and then we'll come back down here and then get that section text. And this allows us a ton more flexibility in our operations. It also allows us to build vertically as opposed to horizontally. And this allows us to get away from some of the very long make.com flows that I've seen that are like 100 scenarios, and you just have to continuously be dragging all the way to the right if you want to look at where things start and finish. And I don't just think that's unseemly. I think that's just kind of annoying. So yeah, this is a new design pattern that essentially allows you to gain a ton more flexibility and just do a lot of cool things. The next thing I want to talk about is the auto align feature in Make. If I were to look at our old scenario here and then click auto align, you'll see that things just moved around quite a bit. Basically how auto align works is they'll prioritize a flat scenario from start to finish, and then they will put the first running flow or first running branch of a scenario up at the top like here, which is why we just swapped second and first. In addition, you'll see that they sort of spread them out equally here. So it goes straight, and then there's one arm that goes up, another arm that goes down. I don't actually like designing my flows like this, and I think that the way that I do it is much better because it instantly provides it instantly tells you both the hierarchy, the way that things are laid out, and then like what is the main route of the flow, and then what's the accessory route of the flow. What I mean by this is if we go back to this previous scenario, you'll see that the way this works is it's basically just one long straight line path at the very bottom. And then above it, you have these branches, and these branches come and then they continue straight forward. And so in this way, we sort of know logically that everything at the bottom is just sort of the main route, and then things that branch off from that main route, these are just accessories. I also think that this allows us to cram more information in the same area. If I were to try and click auto align, look at what Make would do to this. You see how it sort of branches it out and then adds these break modules and sticks them all the way in the corner, and these angles aren't equal, and personally I just think it's pretty ugly. If you were to just go back here, discard these changes. This is, to me, is just a much simpler and easier way to do it. So this is just my opinion, but this is how I've built scenarios for a very long time. I learned it from a good friend of mine and business partner a couple of years ago, and I just think that this is a much more beautiful and simplistic way to do things. The last thing I'll mention there is not only do you get to stack modules vertically, which helps you save space, but the way that I spread these out is I do exactly 3 of these tiny bubbles in between module to module. To me, this is just the simplest way of going about things. So I'd recommend that if you guys were to do something similar, you just do, like when you auto align, it automatically adds 3 little bubbles between, but this just provides you enough room so that if you were to add a filter, you could read the filter, where it's not so much room that if you want to grasp the full scenario, you constantly have to be moving left to right here. From a workflow perspective, it's a lot cleaner. All right, let's talk a little bit about API calls now. Some APIs are slow, and so in order to make them work, you need to space out the first and second calls a little bit. And you'll notice that I do this in a lot of my videos. I'll have one module, then a sleep module, and then another module. And the 2 side modules will work on the same API. The sleep module in the middle just gives them a little bit of space. I have here a ClickUp flow. It's just two modules. One creates a task, the other gets a task. This is probably not going to break in this particular instance, but I've run this over 1,000 times across my old writing business. And what I found was something like 10% of the time, there'd be some issue if you stack to create a task and get a task and put them side by side, because you'll create the task and then you will get that same task that you just created. Sometimes the ClickUp API is just a little bit slow and it doesn't have the time to actually finish creating the record before the next module runs. And then you end up with an error here because it's like, wait a second, we're trying to get an empty task, right? This has worked in this particular scenario run, but if you want it to work across all scenario runs, a very quick and easy way to do it is just go down to Tools, Sleep, and just add at least a second delay in between the two. And a second is usually more than enough time to eliminate 99.999% of errors. So if you've run into some inconsistencies, if you run into some weird things that logically shouldn't really make sense, just add a sleep module in between, especially for like business applications, project management based things. Adding an additional second to your flow will not ruin anything. It'll be perfectly fine. And this just solves a lot of the common gotchas that people experience when they're designing make.com flows for their first time. The other one is I want to talk about syntax and how you can write variables without necessarily needing those variables to be present. If I go over here and add a set multiple variables module, I'm just going to auto align this so I can see it a little better. And let's just say I wanted to do the name of the record. Then I'm just going to grab this task name here. Well, have you ever experienced something where you try and get a variable, but that variable doesn't exist in the previous module? And for whatever reason here on the right-hand side, you're just not finding that specific variable. To me, this happens all the time. And there's actually a really quick and easy way that you can just access the same thing regardless. All you need to do is you need to put the raw name in between two curly braces. So what I'm doing here, sorry, there's just a little fire truck outside. But what I'm doing here is I'm going to add two left curly braces, and then if I just mouse over this, you see how it says raw name? I'm just going to put name here. You notice that doesn't work. So you have to go one step further. What you have to do is go curly braces, 1, so you have to get the number here, dot name, and then close it out like that. And it'll automatically transform it into whatever the variable is. So you go curly brace, 1 dot name, voila. In make.com, all modules have their own number, which is why when I just put in name, it was black. It didn't really make any sense. If I tried 2.name, you'll see here that I'm now selecting from a different module. Previously, I was selecting from this one. Now I'm selecting from this one. So, you just need to make sure to put the number of the module that you are calling into whatever this is. And this works with any one of these. So if I wanted to, I don't know, get this color. Notice how it says raw color. And the parent says raw status. So what I have to do is I have to go 1, and then I have to do a dot and then write status. And then underneath I have to write the child there, which is color. So see here now that I'm getting status color. Obviously I could click on this, but I could also write 1 status type if I wanted to get type, or 1, let's see, what's this order index? 1 dot order index, like this, in order to get order index. Maybe I wanted to grab the sharing here. So I'd go 1.sharing.seo optimized, right? This works even if the variable is unselectable. So if I knew that there was theoretically a variable somewhere around here that, for whatever reason wasn't popping up in my module picker, I could go 1.space. I don't know, let's just pretend there's a child of space called token value. You'll see that now instead of it being filled in, it's just bordered here. And this tells you that, hey man, the module that you're calling exists. And so do some of the variables, but the exact final one here, we can't actually find in the test history. So we're going to fill this in for now. And then if the data is available when you run, we're going to add it. But if not, you're going to have some error. It's going to be an empty value. So yeah, that's how you use this syntax. You'll notice that if you do 2 left curly brackets and 2 right ones, it just disappears. That's because this is just make.com's way of demarcating what is a variable or not. If you go to the text and binary functions, for instance, and you want to put in some of these keywords, if you just do the keyword surrounded by 2 curly brackets, you'll actually be able to instantly create one of these. You'll notice that this works for the keywords. It doesn't really work for the functions because it just thinks we're trying to call a function or a keyword called length. If you want to do functions, you have to write the variable name and then you have to do a left bracket instead, just like this. So notice that, no other combination works, but if I just do a little left bracket, it just pattern matches that as a function that exists. If you want to call a variable here, like UUID, same thing. Let me just see if there's anything else here that maybe you guys could see. If you want to do mathematical operators, just curly braces and then put an equal sign. Like this is just a string that has an equal sign, but this is the actual mathematical operator in make that has the equal sign. Same thing if you wanted to do this. Same thing if you wanted to do, oh, I don't think and works actually, unfortunately. I think you have to do an and here. There you go. And then I think for or, you have to do a pipe. So it has to be this vertical pipe. But, you know, the vast majority of the way that this works is pretty self-explanatory after you figure out this value. So play around with that and see what other sort of variable values, names there are both in make and then in your previous module run histories. The next thing I want to talk about is the email module and why it is vastly superior to the Gmail module. So if I click on this favorites and I click add, you'll notice that there's an email module. If I go to Gmail, you also notice that there's a Gmail module. Most people, when they're starting out in Make, they'll be using Gmail and they'll think, well, I'm just going to use the Gmail module because Gmail specifically for email. This is just one of those things that you're not going to know unless you use Make a bunch. The Gmail module is just vastly inferior to the email module in basically every way. The Gmail module's filtering just doesn't work very well. I'm not going to like hit you over the head with this 1,000,001 times. I'm just going to say that everything that you can do in the Gmail module, you can do in the email module instead. It's the exact same connection. It's just faster. It's more accurate, I'll find. So anytime that you're going to use the Gmail module, just use the email module instead. As I mentioned, all the same functionality exists. It just tends to run a lot faster and more accurately. And then the Gmail module tends to have a bunch of issues with connections where you have to reconnect constantly. And this just solves that. So you're not going to have to. The next thing I'm going to talk about is prioritizing ACID and instant triggers, as opposed to ones that are just ACID or ones that are just schedule-based that don't have either. If I were to try and create a typeform module here, you notice that under responses, which is a trigger, there are a variety of different modules I can choose from. There's get a response file, list responses, watch responses, and then watch responses instant ACID. You're probably wondering what the difference between these two is. Well, if I were to use this watch responses module, you just give myself a little bit of space here, so for jumping around, and then zoom in, and let's just hypothetically say I wanted to use one of the many forms that I've developed. Maybe this one right here. You'll notice that I have an ability to choose where to start. So I could start from now on, since a specific date. I could choose all of my records, or I could choose manually. I could actually like reach and choose a specific one. In my case, I don't have any because I don't think this form has run. But the difference between the instant modules and then the ones that are just ACID is you'll notice that this has a clock next to it with a schedule. The reason why is because it's basically asking you, hey, what interval do you want us to check to see whether or not something has been put in? A new form submission or a new contact record or whatever the specifics of the module you're working with. This is called polling, and it's a vastly inefficient way of getting data. The alternative is event-driven flows, which have the term instant next to them. And notice how these have the exact same name, watch responses and watch responses. But if I move this here, that schedule, that little clock changes to an electricity sort of thunder thing. The reason why is because this one runs instantly whenever a new response comes in, because this is event-driven, this is webhook-driven. And these are fundamentally different ways of doing the same thing. If you think about it, if I were to use this and this were to run every 15 minutes, basically what's happening under the hood is every 15 minutes, I'm checking to see if something has been entered, like a new type form has been filled out. And if you think about it, 15 minutes is a quarter of an hour, right? So it happens 4 times an hour. And if you want to do it every single hour, that's 96 times a day. So if all I were doing were this, then every day I'd be wasting 100 operations. What if my flow looked like this? Well, now every day I'm wasting 400 operations, or I'm doing 12,000 a month, right? That flow in and of itself is enough to completely exhaust all of your operations for the month if you're on one of like the normal 10K a month plans. Whereas if you were to do something like this instant trigger, let's say you only got 2 form submissions a day. Even if you added all these up together, that's only running a total of 8 operations. So as you can see, these webhook-driven or event-driven flows are substantially more efficient. And so if you have a choice to choose between an instant and then one that's just ACID, always choose the instant. Instant will just make your life a lot easier. Okay, on that note, if you find some piece of functionality that you need, or you're looking for some type of trigger, and you notice that there's no instant thing associated with that trigger. Like for instance, this email is watch emails. You'll notice that this watch emails runs the exact same thing as that previous one did. Sorry, I have to select the right folder here. So let me just choose this, and then I'm just going to make this, I don't think my connection works actually. Let me see. This is probably the most recent one, if I were to guess. Might have to reconnect it. Again, because it's been about a month and I've changed my whole thing a bunch. Okay, I'm going to go to inbox here. And then I'm going to do all emails. Notice that I have to choose where to start again, but if I right click and press run this module only, sorry, I haven't chosen where to start. Let's just do all emails. It'll actually go and it'll grab the first email in my inbox, right? 46 years old and starting over. Somebody sent me a message basically asking me for some help quite a while back. But anyway, the point that I'm making is this is not webhook driven. It's not event driven. But the cool thing is Make allows you to very easily convert the vast majority of things that are not instant into instant just by creating a webhook and then sort of building your own integration. So webhooks here allow you to essentially create your own thing, right? And if I drag this schedule icon from here down to here, you'll see it change into a Thunder. Well, one very quick and easy way to turn any watch emails flow into one that is event-driven is use a mail hook. And I realize I selected the wrong module there. So let's go here, let's go webhooks, and then we'll go custom mail hook. The way that a mail hook works is it's basically a forwarding address that you just forward emails to. And the second that you forward an email to it, it'll run immediately. If I go down here and then I say new email received, I now am given a URL and this an email address. And this email address is an email address that I can just forward any email to, and the flow will instantly start. I just sent out that email. If I go back here after Gmail, who typically holds emails for another 5 to 10 seconds, just in case you sent the wrong thing. After they do that, you'll see that I've now received my mail hook and it has the text, it has everything I need, and it ran instantly within a few seconds, basically, of me sending that. If I were to use the watch emails module instead, it would just be constantly running in the background every 15, 20, or however many minutes I scheduled it for. It would consume all my operations, and it just also wouldn't be running very quickly. Like, what if it was some use case where I really, really needed, good Lord, apologies. What if it was some use case where I really, really needed to get back to that person immediately? If it was like some transactional email or if it was just something. Well, if I was watching it every 15 minutes, at minimum or at maximum, there'd be about a 15-minute delay between when I received the email and when I responded to it. This way, I might have 10 or 15 seconds instead. All right, in this next one, I'm going to show you guys how to instantly create basically whatever data structure you want very easily. And it's using JSON or JavaScript object notation. I unfortunately learned this pretty late in my Make.com career. I already knew how JSON worked conceptually, and I knew what the format was, but I never really realized I could apply it to Make. Basically, JSON is just this curly brace as an opener, the variable name, and then a colon, and then a variable value. And so this is now JSON that represents something very similar to what we see in Make.com. And the magic here is if you click on this plus, press JSON, and then look for parse JSON and just add whatever the string is that contains JSON here. And if you click run once, the output of that module is going to be basically like the Make.com variable syntax that we can map that we're also used to. So this is what we fed in, and then this is what we got. We actually got something where in a future module, if I wanted to, let's see, set another variable, hypothetically, with that value, we'll notice how now we have a variable called name value. The one from our JSON module here actually has this string in it, curly brace, quote, name, quote, colon, quote, value, quote, curly brace. But now we can actually just reference the value. And in this way, you can create arbitrarily complicated data structures very, very easily. So maybe I have name value, maybe I have a list, and then I have an array item 1, array item 2. We can add, as arbitrarily as many as we want. But now if I were to look at this parse JSON, you'll see that we have a name value and then a list, which is an array, which has these 2 array items. You can imagine how if you're testing something, it's really, really, really convenient because now you can basically provide the entire data structure of the flow that you are looking to do just in these 2 modules. And then instead of you having to go and, fill out a type form every time you want to test the flow or create a new task and ClickUp every time you want to test it, you can just do it here inside of Make. And so you're basically creating artificial data, which makes testing your module way easier. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is array indexing and how to index into an array, which just means select a particular element in an array using numbers. So you know how here we had this set multiple variables module, right? Well, let's say I wanted to grab a specific item from this list here. You see how it says number 1 is array item 1? Well, if you remember, there was a second array item in there called array item 2. I'll prove it to you. If I go to the parse.json module, you'll see that inside of this array, we have array item 2. Well, the question is, Nick, if you click on this, how the heck do I get array item 2? I can only see array item 1. Well, the trick is, if I were to click array item 1 here, and I were to run this, and go back, you'll see that this successfully picked up array item 1. But you'll also notice that all of a sudden, in this variable value field here, there's a space. The purpose of the space is to allow you to select specific elements that are ordered starting from 1 and then ending at however long the list is. So I wanted to get the second item, I would go list and then I would go 2. And this is array indexing. This will allow me to pick that specific element, array item 2, from that array. I could do the same thing arbitrarily many times. So I don't know, I want like 5 array items. Here's 3, here's 4, here's 5. If I run this and maybe I want to get the 4th one, give this thing a little run, you'll see that I'm now grabbing array item 4. If I'm doing 2 instead, I run this, now I'm getting number 2. And then if you do 1, or if you just don't add anything in there, it'll just automatically select the first. All right, next up is how to scrape the HTML of a website in less than 5 seconds. This works for 99.5% of websites out there nowadays because they're all static. All you have to do is create an HTTP module called make a request. This is like the 5th or the 6th one down. It's right over here. Then you just have to type in the URL of the website that you're scraping. I'm going to type in my own. The method needs to be get, and the body type has to be raw, content type, JSON application, JSON, click parse response, yes. Give that a run, and at the other side of the result, you'll see that you basically just got the full HTML of that whole website. The second that you have the HTML of the website, it's the exact same thing that we see here. The second that you have the HTML of the website, you can do really cool things with it. So in a ton of previous videos, I've shown people how to scrape website data by converting things into text. If you go to text parser, you can go HTML to text here. You can convert this HTML into something that's actually readable. Now you have a bunch of information about a person's website. You have a bunch of text. You could feed all of this into AI. So maybe we want to use an OpenAI module called create a completion. Then we just want to write GPT-4o. Let's do user, tell me something about this website. And we're going to feed in this text. We want 4,096 tokens. If I press run once, it's now calling AI with the entire body that I just fed in, which is pretty long, mind you. So we're going to be using a fair number of tokens, but you can imagine how you could text process this to make it shorter. And the result is a very deep, in-depth guide. Maybe instead you want it to output in JSON only, like this, and you want, I don't know, description, 1-line description, email, address. If there is no email, leave it as blank. Well, now what we're doing is if we add a JSON, parse JSON module there, and then feed in the output of that previous run, well, now we basically created our own scraping system. And it only took us a few seconds. Sorry, the reason why it didn't work that time is because it actually output a specific thing there. Don't output any backticks. No. Your first character should be a curly brace. Okay, and now if we run this again, you'll see that we now have basically parsable data here. With a 1-line description, and then we even have an email address field where maybe there's an email on the website. Well, now we can actually parse it in a second, get that, and then if there is an email, we'll do something else. If we don't do it, then if we don't have one, then we'll do something else. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is the presence of a switch module and how switch modules allow you to take a million different possibilities and then just squish them all into one route instead. You know how earlier we talked about if there was an email address, we do one thing. If there wasn't an email address, we do another thing. Well, that's where switch values come in handy. If you think about it logically, if I wanted to do this, what most people would think is they would slap a router in there and then they'd have some function here. I'm just going to use these set variables here because that's a little easier. And then what they do is they'd say, if email address doesn't exist, then we have some top route that's no email. And then if email address exists, then we have some bottom email or bottom route, right? And this may look okay if it's the first time that you built something like this, but you don't actually need any of that. You don't need to split the route up like this. You don't need to add a ton of complexity. Like what usually people will do in routes is they're just going to do the same thing. There's just going to be one tiny little difference between the two. And that's just going to be the presence of that variable or not. And so instead of you having to have two routes with exactly the same thing, you could actually squish all of these together just using the presence of a switch module, which I'll show you how to do right now. So basically, instead of this router, we could shave this down a little bit. I'm going to remove this filter. And all we need to do is go to add and then type in switch. You'll be taken to tools, and then switch is all the way down here at the bottom. And the way that switch works is you basically put the input in here. So the thing that you want to route based off of. So the thing that I want to route based off of is this email address. And then what you can do is you can supply cases, and you could say, hey, if this, then do this. If that, then do this. And then do that. And you get to do all of that right here. And what you do is you get to set the output variable and make it equal to something based off of the presence of an input variable. So for instance, we could have a pattern where if this is empty, then we want to output something. I don't know, maybe we want to output just the words empty, okay? And notice what's going to happen. I'm just going to close this. Notice what's going to happen if we run this now with an empty email. The output to this is now empty. You'll notice that the input to this was the email address, right? But now the output is empty. And so what we're doing is we're switching the output based off of an input. The cool part about switches is you can make them arbitrarily complex. Let's hypothetically say that in addition to, like I just fed in a bunch of website text here, right? So let's actually just say nick.leftclick.ai is in the text that I'm feeding to the AI. Well, now it's going to find this and it's going to add this to my email, right? So let's say that there are a bunch of other routes. Let's say there's one where I'm looking specifically for this, and we'll say it's Nick. And then there's another one where I'm looking for somebody called John. I'll say it's John. Notice how we have three possible routes or three possible variables that we could set the value of based off of the presence of something in here. There's also this else option, which essentially says if it doesn't fit any of these options, then we want to use this. And if I add in the data like this and press run anyway, let's see what happens now. You'll see how the output is it's Nick. Why? Well, because if I look at the JSON, we now have an email address nick equals to leftclick.ai. And so instead of me having to route based off of the presence of an email or the lack of an email or something like that, we could just switch and then use the output variable to do the things that we want it to do. A common thing here is if you are doing something in ClickUp or something in a CRM that has IDs, you could change the subsequent ID based off of the switch. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is a very simple design pattern that I always use in basically every flow. It's what I call the trigger and the list design pattern. So hypothetically, let's say that we have a scenario here that uses Typeform. And this doesn't just work with Typeform, this works with any sort of two-step flow like this. This will work with any form system, basically. So JotForm, it'll work with like a bunch of Google Sheets things. It works with basically anything. The point that I'm making is you'll have some type of action or some type of trigger rather, like the Typeform watch responses module here, which will trigger every time you fill out a form that you select. So every time I fill out this content generator brief webhook thing, it'll fire and then it'll run. And then the vast majority of these form platforms or these inputs usually have another module that lists or searches or gets a bunch of responses. And so the reason why I split these into two parts here, and the reason why this is so valuable, is because essentially if you're testing a big flow that requires a form to be used as the input to that flow, then anytime you want to test that flow, you basically have to go through and you have to fill out the entire form again. So if I wanted to run this thing, I would literally have to go through this content generator brief and I have to fill this out every freaking time that I wanted to run the thing. And you can imagine now if I actually wanted to fill out like this form with like legitimate good looking data, it would probably take me like 2 minutes every single time that I wanted to run this thing. If it takes you 2 minutes to run a scenario just to test it, and you test it even like 15 times, which I would say is an average number of times that I test something, you just added half an hour to your build time here. Instead, what you do is you split this up into two parts, one that watches and then another that lists. And when a form is submitted, it runs this watch. But then it also has a list. And I split these with a sleep because I like to make sure that there's enough time between the two, like I talked about earlier. But anytime you want to test, all you do is you unlink this and then you drag this to the list. And then you can just right click and press run this module only. And that way you can actually just get the exact same data that you just filled out And you can just repeat that over and over and over and over and over again. So instead of you having to physically go through and fill out a form every time, now it takes you 2 seconds. You just right click, run this module only. You ensure that that has the data that you want, and then you just start the rest of the flow using that. So very, very quick and easy way of doing this. In order to make this work the best, you should probably just set limit to 1. So I'm just going to write limit equals 1 for Typeform. This works with Google Sheets too. Google Sheets has like a search rows module. This works with the vast majority of form systems. This works with basically everything. And it's just a quick and easy way to ensure that when you test fast. Again, the whole point of make.com is to minimize the feedback loop. If you really want to do this well, you just minimize the amount of time between when you test something and then when you see the results of that test. Okay, another thing I want to talk about is a second design pattern that I use, which I call the split and the get design pattern. And if you've watched a couple of my videos, you've probably seen me do this. So let's say that I'm going to use this JSON flow that I developed here earlier. Let's say that I have a full name value, and the name is me, Nick Sarayev, okay? I'm going to take that, and then I'm going to parse it, right? And when I parse it, what's going to happen? Well, we're going to get a result that says Nick Sarayev. But let's hypothetically say I don't actually care about the full name. I just want to get the first name. How do I get it really quickly? Well, I use split and get. So let's do first name. Let's also do last name just for shits. The question is, how do you get only the first half of this name? Well, you use the fact that there's a white space in between to split the variable based off of the presence of a space like that. Now, if I were to do this, I'm just going to copy this in both here. If I were to do this and then run, what is the output of this? You'll notice that the output is we now have an array with the first and the last name split into 1 and then 2. So we've already done half the battle. All we have to do now is we have to select or index the specific element in the array that we want. And similar to array indexing like I showed you earlier, it's just instead of using that dot notation thing that we were doing, sorry, not the dot notation, but the bracket notation thing we were doing earlier, we just use the function called get. We get, and then we do a bracket. Then I move to the end here, and then I select which result I want, first or second. So I selected the first result there. If I want to do this and get the last name here, what I would do is I would go to the end and then press 2. And now if I press run once, you'll notice that I now have the first name where I want it to be, the last name where I want it to be. This doesn't just work on first names, last names, or sort of like name-related things. This works with basically anything. Once you get the keyboard shortcuts down, you'll notice that it's super easy. I can do this whole thing in like 1 second, basically split this based off the presence of a space, and then get this based off of its position 1 or 2. That took a little longer than 1 second, but I think you guys catch my drift. All right, so remember a moment ago where I showed you guys this 2-step design pattern with a watch and then a list. Well, I have another hack that works quite similarly to this and works for instances where you're not just trying to trigger something, but you just want to test a particular part of a scenario based off of data that you've cached or stored. And what I do in order to accomplish this is I use the set variables module here. So if you think about it, what this function here is doing is this is searching a Google Sheet and it's just getting a bunch of rows. And I'm getting a bunch of variables like title, word count, primary keyword, and that sort of thing. But what I've done here is I've actually set the variables here. And let me give you maybe an even better example. Like if I were to take all of this data, okay, here's why this works so well. So in my particular flow, what I'm doing is I'm feeding in a bunch of variables to AI. And I'm basically just doing a bunch of example content. And then I'm saying, hey, here's the title, here's the word count, here's the primary keyword, secondary keyword, internal links, external links, additional instructions. Well, the reason why this design pattern is so valuable, like if you think about it, I could have just selected all this data from the Google Sheet instead, but I chose to do it from this. The reason why this is so valuable is because anytime I want to test this flow, okay, I could just use the set variables module as the trigger. And I do that by just dragging this all the way over here. Now, the set variables module is currently referencing a bunch of Google Sheet data, but what if instead I just write what I want to do here? Right now it's 22. There may be more. Who knows? I don't know. Right? What if I just set it all and I hard code it here? Well, now I can actually run my entire scenario just from this module. I don't need to bother myself with any of the beginning part of this module. And if you set up your scenario right, you'll notice that despite the fact that I broke off arguably the most important part of this whole flow, which is the beginning and the trigger, there's no error in any of these subsequent modules. There's no little red or orange icon that'll pop up saying, hey man, you're missing a module name or variable here. Because what I've done is I've just made sure that everything starts here. And if I fill in the variables manually like this, now I can just test it using the same data. And you can imagine this is really, really good for expediting the rate at which you build flows. The next thing I want to talk about is storing incomplete executions and then using this break module. Now, if you've looked at my scenarios and you're not familiar with the break, the first thing that you probably ask yourself is, Nick, why is there a bunch of little orange pause icons on top of a few modules? Why are they on top of these orange modules and not on top of all the other ones? Well, basically what this is this is a way where if an API is rate limiting you, or if there's some error in your API call, there's some issue, you can store that data and then run it in 15 or 20 minutes instead when maybe your rate limit isn't fixed or maybe when the API is back online. In order to trigger this, what you need to do is you need to go down to the settings icon and then click allow storing of incomplete execution. So press this yes button. And then what you want to do is you want to go to flow control. What you're looking for is you're looking for this break icon here. Now, the only situation which you'd actually want to use a break icon is on an API call, usually on some type of like AI large language model thing, or just an API that you know is a little bit shoddy. It doesn't work all the time. I mean, if I were to use it on this markdown to HTML module, this would do nothing because the markdown to HTML module is just a make.com built-in. It basically never breaks. There's just no point to do it. But if you give this a click, you'll see that you can select the number of attempts you want to give it to retry, and then you can also set the interval between attempts. You could say 15 minutes. You could say up to 44,640 minutes. Pretty crazy, right? And basically, I use this on every large language model that I run in production, meaning that anytime I'm running something on an actual client website or on my own business, I will always use the break module because there will inevitably be problems. There'll inevitably be some downtime. We'll inevitably hit rate limits. And this just ensures that the flow doesn't completely stop and completely break. It ensures that if there is an issue, well, 15 minutes from now, it'll be resolved. On that note, I want to show you guys a very special variable that most people don't know exists. If you go down here to the settings icon and then click show advanced settings and scroll down, you'll see that there's a number of consecutive errors field. You can actually set the number of errors that you are comfortable dealing with before it deactivates the scenario for you. The reason why this is valuable is because if you're running something that costs a lot of money every time it goes, if it fails like once or really more than once, you're going to be spending a fair amount on that, right? And so you can make your scenario a little bit more fragile and you can make it actually just like forcefully deactivate if there's ever a problem. I've done this before to save a few $100s a month in token costs, where when I know that there's some AI module that doesn't always work and sometimes it's a little bit shitty and it's not critical to the functioning of my business, but sometimes it's nice to have, I will set this to 1. And then anytime that there is an error, basically, it will automatically deactivate the scenario and send me an email. That way it doesn't run on a bunch of bogus or bunk data and I get to save some money. I'm not saying that you should do this. I'm just saying that this is a lever that you could pull to give yourself a little bit more control over how make.com works for you. Alternatively, maybe you never want it to deactivate. I don't know, you set it at 1,000 or something like that. So even if there's an error, it'll continue to run and it's not that big of a deal. All right, the second last thing I'm going to talk about is the iterator and the aggregator. If you've seen my iterator and aggregator breakdown, this is just going to be a brief rehash of this. I'm going to touch it a little lighter than I normally do. But essentially what you have, if I go to tools here, and then if I have, actually, let's do this. Let's go to Google Sheets instead. This one right here. I'm just going to paste this because I don't want to completely screw up my flow. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click, press run this module only. You're seeing I'm going to get a ton of data basically on what is in my Google Sheet, right? If I were to hypothetically set the maximum number of return rows to, let's say 3, okay? Now I'm going to disconnect this. I'm going to make this the trigger, and I'm just going to have my own little mini scenario on top of here that isn't really related to this. Let's say I want to set a variable here, and I just want this to be the title. If I generate 3 results like I just allowed it to, what you'll see is the first scenario is going to run once, the second scenario is going to run 3 times. That's because of the number of bundles that are output. The search rows module, the list form entries module, the watch whatever module, a lot of the time if these will have a setting that asks you how many results you want to deliver. If you do more than 1, it'll run every subsequent module however many times you select it to, based off of different data every time, right? So these are 3 different titles that I got from the first bundle, second bundle, and third bundle, and we just changed the variable here. Well, if instead of running it 3 times, I just wanted it to run once, what I could do is I could feed this into an array aggregator. I can then aggregate all of these fields, and then I could set this variable value to be the array. And what this is going to do is this is going to turn multiple runs, so multiple bundles over here, into one bundle with a bunch of different array items. So now the variable value isn't 3 separate things. It's one with the value, the key name title. And then inside of title, we have each of these 3 arrays that I've fed in. If I wanted to only grab the title, I could just do title and I could run it. And it would just be in a single bundle with 3 items, right? But that's more or less how the aggregator module works. If I wanted to convert this back into something that ran on a bundle basis, aka that executed every subsequent module, I could just feed in this array to an iterator again, and then I could get the results of this. And then we would be right back at square one. Now we have 3 operations used, 3 bundles, and every bundle subsequently downstream is selected a different title. Iterators and aggregators are sort of beyond the scope of this video. If you don't know how they work and if this is just black magic to you, then please do check out my deep dive. I talk a lot about how they work and how they can add a ton of value to your make.com flows. The last thing I'm going to touch on briefly is status codes. Status codes are not super crazy important to know, so I'm only going to cover this very briefly. But basically, anytime you do any sort of HTTP request or call a website, you receive this status code parameter. And this is just like a code that somebody 30 years ago decided would be equivalent to like a thumbs up, like, hey, everything worked. There are a variety of status codes out there. 200 means that things worked. We'll do a patch request. I'm going to right click. You're going to get a 405 method not allowed. That status code basically says, hey, this isn't working. The 400 series of status code just means like there's some issue. 405 particularly means the method is not allowed. So I tried calling a website that can only be called through get, and I tried calling it through patch. If there's like an authorization, I think there's like an authorization error status code. I think that's 401. And so this isn't so much as a quick hack as it is just understanding what these HTTP modules are telling you. If you run scenarios that frequently access websites or try and scrape data, then just spend like 5 or 10 minutes Googling HTTP status codes, and then spend just a few moments just like reading up on what they all are. A lot of them aren't really that useful, but generally speaking, 2XX means success, 3XX means redirection, and then 4XX means there's some issue with the client. 5XX means that there's some issue with the server. And if there's like a server error, if you receive a 5XX response, so 5 something something, odds are it's like an API issue. It's not necessarily related to you. Although I will say some APIs like really suck with this and they just don't have good error handling. So they'll return a 5XX server error, even if the real issue is something on your end. But that's a topic for another video. All right. I hope you guys appreciated this video and our 21 or 22 quick make.com hacks. I had a lot of fun putting it together. If you guys have any questions about any of the quick little things that I talked about here, you want me to dive into it a little deeper, just drop a comment down below. I get most of my ideas now from the video comments that I receive, simply because it's sort of hard to continue producing content otherwise. I really want to create content that solves particular problems that people are suffering from today, not like theoretical grand problems that people aren't. So yeah, keep them coming. Otherwise, if you could do me a big favor and like and subscribe to my channel, that would mean a lot. Thank you very much for watching and looking forward to the next one. See you guys later.